Right. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here for me. So I've been working on menstruation for a very long time, with long interruptions as well. I'm a medieval literary historian, working mostly on German literature, and I did my PhD on blood. The resulting book is at the back for anyone who wants to see it. And I did that in 1998 to 2001, when there was very little interest in menstruation and little research out there. So it's so exciting to see this a burgeoning field. And I think it's not just within academia that it's becoming more and more important and rapid changes are made, but also in the real world, especially in the UK and in Scotland. We've been making so much progress. But as we've also heard this morning already, the age-old stigmas attached to menstruation still persist. Stigmata, that's my medievalist brain coming out, and it's very important for us. So what I'd like to today is kind of give a longue durée history of some of these stereotypes that we still feel a lot. One of the most dominant unspoken ideas about menstruation in contemporary Western culture is still that menstrual bleeding is a somewhat shameful, uncontrollable leakage out of the body that should be hidden at all costs, and that's already been borne out this morning. This is something that many feminists and artists are trying to change, but still dominates public discourse. Other less pervasive, but nonetheless still widespread beliefs are that though some men, especially trans men, may be able to menstruate, this is somehow unmanly. That heterosexual intercourse during menstruation is somehow unusual, and even that menstrual bleeding and the use of tampons somehow entails a loss of virginity. How can we explain the continuing stigmatizing assumptions about menstruation, given that they have absolutely no basis in contemporary scientific thought? Such beliefs actually have much deeper historical roots than most studies of menstruation allow for, namely in pre-modern and early modern culture and medicine. That is, they go back to the era before the year 1500, when the start of modernity is normally set. An awareness of these roots can help us both understand where such prejudices originate, with a particular scientific and philosophical set of assumptions about gender. It also helps us understand why they persist, namely because some of the cultural assumptions about gender have not changed, though the science has. However, making the case that the stigmatization of menstruation as leakage and as polluting is actually based on ancient and medieval medical beliefs might be a better argument for changing these beliefs. So academic investigation can here help to make an activist case as well. In the following, I will briefly discuss the four beliefs mentioned above: menstruation as leakage, menstruation as unmanly, sex during menstruation as abnormal, and menarche as a loss of virginity, and show that they originate with ancient and medieval medicine. All of them have to do with gendered issues of control over one's body, and the female body being defined as less cohesive than the male, not being able to control its blood flow, and with menstrual blood being unclean and polluting for those who come into contact with it. I want to stress at the outset that these stigmatizing views of menstruation were not the only ones available in the Middle Ages and Antiquity, any more than they are the only ones available now. Medieval practical medicine had a range of pro-female ways of alleviating menstrual problems and valuing menstrual bleeding positively. But in natural philosophical thought, the precursor of academic science rather than practical medicine, which was based to a large extent on the thinking of Aristotle and Galen, the stigmatizing views were dominant, and this is the uncomfortable subject that I'm focusing on today. So first, menstruation as leakage. Even today, the menstrual cycle is still predominantly reduced to its most visible sign, a more or less regularly monthly vaginal discharge. This discharge is more precisely seen as blood leaking out of the body. An uncontrollable flow, a lack of containment, something that needs to be avoided and kept invisible to others. Anecdotal evidence includes Rupi Kaur's famous image of her stained trousers and bedding that was removed from Instagram. Academic evidence is provided, for example, by Camilla Röstvik in her study of the ideal of cleanliness in traditional advertising and its subversion in art and, to some extent, in popular culture. In Lara Freidenfeld's anthropological study of the 20th century United States, all women interviewed reported making, quote, efforts to hide the menstrual blood. And Lara Owens has observed similar things in contemporary Melbourne. Controlling the blood flow was seen as an issue of modernity, especially in the 1920s and 30s, when, to quote Freidenfels, advertisers presented a vision of a modern body that was well managed, did not leak or smell. However, this understanding of menstrual blood as leakage and the ideal of a contained body that is not confined to the modern body, but goes back to ancient and medieval ideas about women's bodies as leaky and uncontrolled. Medieval medicine and physiology were based on the ancient Greek theory of the four humours, where being hot or cold and moist or dry were the most essential qualities of every body, and health depended on keeping them in the right balance. Traditional Chinese and Ayurvedic medicine, if you're familiar with that, are still based on similar concepts. The body's temperature was strongly gendered. All women were colder than all men. Even the hottest woman was colder than the coldest man. In addition, women were moister. Heat was more desirable, of course, as it allowed food to be processed into bodily fluids to a higher degree of purification. Semen was the most refined of the bodily fluids, because men's hot bodies could concoct food better. Menstrual blood was also processed from food, but stayed less pure and more watery than semen, because women were too cold, so its flow out of the body could not be contained. An influential tradition of natural philosophical texts in the Middle Ages were the so-called Secreta Mulierum, or Secrets of Women, a popular guide explaining female physiology, erroneously ascribed to the philosopher Albert the Great, and translated into many languages and copied in many manuscripts. A 15th century Southern German version details: the third question is why the aforementioned matter, menstrual blood, which is a residual matter from food and drink, flows out of women, when semen is also a residual matter from food and drink, but does not flow out of men. The answer is that women are moist and cold by nature, and man is warm and dry by nature, and everything moist must flow. As I have argued at length in my monograph Medieval Blood, this constructs a gender difference of physical and personal integrity. Women are not able to contain their bodily fluids as well as men, and this is constituted as a sign of their general weakness and inferiority. Only men could ever be fully in control of their bodies and fully self-contained. Modern Western science, of course, does not share these assumptions about the humus, about the temperature difference between genders, or about the digestion of food into blood any longer. However, the patriarchal assumption that female bodies are inferior and always potentially embarrassing has, unlike the science, not fundamentally changed. This has allowed a view of menstrual blood as leakage, as showing a lack of control, to persist in a continuing requirement to hide menstrual blood. A second menstruation as unmanly. Some men, mostly trans men, menstruate. Nonetheless, menstruation is still seen not only as exclusively experienced by women, but also specifically as unmanly. This is witnessed anecdotally by the marketing of tampons and other so-called feminine hygiene products in stereotypically feminized ways, pink and diva-like. Academic evidence comes from Brianna Farr's insightful analysis of trans men's common perception of menstruating as undermining their masculinity, and therefore a traumatic reminder of being in the wrong body. The idea that menstruating is not only feminine, but also unmanly, goes again back to pre-modern culture and natural philosophy. Then as now, some men were believed to menstruate. Anal bleeding for men that we would now ascribe to hemorrhoids was seen as the male equivalent to menstruation, as were nosebleeds. These spontaneous, uncontrollable bleeds were understood as a sign that these men had not fully digested their bodily fluids and were lacking in the normal masculine control of their bodies. Anti-Semitic thought, for instance, in Johannes Hartlieb's 15th century version of The Secrets of Women, ascribed this bodily weakness especially to Jewish men, who were cold and moist like women. The awareness that maybe men were not quite as different biologically from women as they might wish for led to considerable anxiety and even greater attempts to prove the inferiority of women and some men scientifically. Menstrual bleeding was contrasted not only with the more cohesive, better processed semen, but also with male heroic bleeding. Men were expected to bleed in medieval elite culture, but this was supposed to happen not spontaneously from orifices, but through being wounded in battle and in chivalric fights. a heroic wound was interpreted as a sign of having bravely engaged in combat, as a crisis that, if successfully overcome, would actually confirm a man's bodily integrity and status. As Peggy McCracken has shown for Old French Romance literature, when women bled, this was interpreted as a sign of the curse of Eve and of lesser physical integrity. When male characters bled, this was a sign of their heroism and bravery. When we perceive menstruation as feminine and unmanly, we continue these stereotypes that again came from an outdated set of medical beliefs and chivalric culture. It is a powerful move to redefine menstrual bleeding as heroic, as some feminist activists have done under the slogan, "Anything you can do, I can do bleeding." Gloria Steinem also configures bleeding as a sign of bravery and strength in her famous 1978 essay, If Men Could Menstruate, imagining that men, quote, would brag about how much and how long. Now that it has become more normal for men to menstruate, the next step might be to try to move away from the notion of heroic versus uncontrolled bleeding altogether. Third, menstrual sex is abnormal. All the fun topics, I don't know why I do this. Heterosexual intercourse during menstrual bleeding is still commonly perceived as unusual in several ways. Freidenfeld details that medical researchers and sex educators such as Havelock Ellis in the first part of the 20th century believed that women's sexual appetites were stronger during their menstrual period, and that, quote, bad blood that carried bacteria could be passed into a man if he had sex with a woman then. As Lauren Rosewarne observes, the taboo against sex during menstrual bleeding might be in decline in reality, but sex while bleeding is still very rarely portrayed in American mainstream culture. And if so, it is marked out as, quote, non-vanilla and non-conforming. So such beliefs, as you'll guess by now, again go back to pre-modern physiological ideas. The Secrets of Women tradition details that menstrual blood, because it was not well-processed food, contained various impurities that could be poisonous to those who came into contact with it. For the women who retained menstrual blood, it increased their sexual appetites and particularly made them crave semen as the hotter, more refined equivalent to menstrual blood. For the men, the loss of their precious semen would weaken them, and those who came into contact with menstrual blood might be polluted. Knowing these long-standing links between an increased appetite for sex, but also a perceived danger in heterosexual intercourse, especially for the male partners, can help us understand why menstrual sex is still seen as exceptional in many contexts. Knowing that fears about it are based in pre-modern medical thought might help to normalize and demystify sexual contact during menstrual bleeding. Finally, menarche is confused with loss of virginity. Related to the idea of women having increased libidos during menstrual bleeding is my final prejudice against menstruation, the conflation of menarche with defloration. Rosewarne describes, quote, menarche as being frequently portrayed as the transition point from girlhood to womanhood in popular culture, including, quote, a move toward a sexual identity, often seen as a loss of innocence. Freidenfeld details the 20th century history of the persistent concern that tampon use might rob girls of their virginity by breaking the hymen, which we've already heard about. So virginity not defined as never having had sexual intercourse, but as an intact hymen. Again, this belief has old roots in pre-modern natural philosophy, where there was also a frequent confusion between a ruptured hymen and menarche. Both were breakages of the integrity of the female body. While virgins could claim some of the coherence normally reserved for male bodies, this was not the case once the hymen was broken. The blood that was believed to always appear during a woman's first penetrative sex was believed to be menstrual blood, as if sexual intercourse could bring on menstrual bleeding. The Secrets of Women states that a woman, quote, is to be slept with when she has her first period, associating sexual maturity automatically with the start of sexual activity. Knowing about this outdated confusion can help us identify that something so obviously untrue still seems to be a confusing issue, especially for girls today, and might betray some deeper assumptions about sexual availability necessarily coinciding with puberty. So to conclude, what do we gain from knowing that some of our most persistent negative beliefs about menstruation are of ancient and medieval origin? First, knowing medieval conceptions of menstruation allows us to see some of the patterns that persist today that we might not otherwise identify. that so much of contemporary conceptions about menstruation is about gendering bodies into male, whole, self-contained bodies and female, damaged, uncontrollably leaking and polluting bodies is something that becomes more clearly visible on the background of pre-modern patterns. Second, knowing that some of these conceptions were rooted in a very different medical and philosophical belief system allows us to see that maybe they should be obsolete now, as they no longer fit modern science. Third, their persistence despite medical advances nonetheless shows that they still fulfill an important function in patriarchal and misogynistic thought. We are more medieval than we would like to be. And finally, the knowledge that they are based in such medieval modes of thought from which we moderns normally like to distance ourselves in our narratives of progress, allows us to make the argument that it really is time to leave behind the ideas that a menstrual cycle can be reduced to bleeding, that bleeding is leakage, that it is feminine, that it does not fit with heteronormative sex, that it is a loss of virginity, and most of all, that menstruation is a stigma. Thank you.
I was just wondering what advice you have or what you'd like to see from researchers and activists who started more recently. And thank you for starting it before that.
Oh, that's a great question to get. Normally I think like, what do the moderns, what do the contemporaries want of me? You know, what can a historical perspective possibly add? So I've tried my hardest to kind of make that argument. What I would like is some deeper historical awareness. I think there is a lot of kind of reinventing of the wheel, and it does depress me. I mean, like you could tell from my delivery, it's like, it's so heavy. Every time I talk to Camilla, it's like, why have we not moved on? This is, you know, and if we can make the case that this is really, you know, I'm a medievalist, I love the Middle Ages, so, but like, it's really not appropriate anymore. It's, you know, it made a whole lot of sense then. It does not make a whole lot of sense now. So, you know, of course, most of us in this room have long moved on from these beliefs, but they are still so persistent. And, you know, I think I'd like us as a collective to keep making this argument to say, like, it's not acceptable anymore. It's not okay anymore to believe this.
Hi, thank you. That was such an interesting talk. I wanted to ask a question based on your points about menstruation being seen as feminine. And I know you talk about it in the context of trans men, but was there any reference to the loss of menstruation that occurs around menopause affecting the femininity of women in medieval texts?
Yeah, absolutely. Interestingly, it if anything, increased it. So the narrative about the menopause is that you have even more menstrual blood because it doesn't get purged regularly. So it's retained in your body. So that means the poisonous, the noxious elements of it continue. And in fact, your sexual appetites often increase because of this. So even that is not a win situation. The only kind of out of this being associated with the stigmatized menstrual blood is being a virgin. So before the first menstrual flow, virgins in many contexts, and again in fiction, in saints' lives, were often seen to be almost equaling male power, and you know this bodily integrity, because they'd never been penetrated, was seen as a great sign of strength, actually, but not after the menopause, no.
Hi, we know that most of the stuff that was written down in the olden days was written down by men. So I'm kind of interested what implications that has for your research, and I liked the reference you made at the very beginning to the idea that it was there was a female powerful screw you subculture of women taking control and doing their own thing. But how do we know, how do you capture that if it's not written down?
That's a problem. It's like, you know, it's very difficult to access. So there's a famous work written by what we think is a female medical practitioner, Trotula, who you know gives a lot of practical recipes dealing with menstruation, but also female reproduction, fertility in general. But this is really one of the very rare sources, because practical medicine was transmitted mainly orally. They didn't teach at universities. They didn't leave the written documents that the male elite culture did. So it's really hard to access, and you have to tease it out. So what you get is the voices of some elite women. those you can reconstruct because sometimes they had access to written text. But yeah, and like like I said, I don't want to give the impression that the whole of the Middle Ages was terrible. This is a particular part of culture, but that unfortunately was the dominant sort of theoretical approach because that persisted. And like one of the things that I keep asking myself is how could men possibly believe this stuff? I haven't even told you the crazier beliefs associated with this. So some of the texts come from a clerical culture where men live together in collectives with other men and don't particularly meet many women and certainly not have sexual contact with them. So that is part of the persistence. But the other part of it is that ideology is a powerful thing. So if you're constantly told as a young girl your menstrual blood is really terrible, and if you bake while you're menstruating it'll spoil the dough, if you look in the mirror while menstruating it'll stain it, then you start to believe it. If everyone around you thinks it, it's like it's like gaslighting. It gets into you. So yeah, and the other issue is it is still continuing today. So we're still complicit in this sort of master-slave thinking there.
Can I ask one really quick extra question, which is the kind of narrative that we hear speaking to mums and daughters and humans is that the kind of perception that menarche is getting younger and younger, and is it something in the water and all of that. Is there any documentation from your kind of academic, because Wikipedia says it happened in the olden days, that people hit puberty older, but I don't know whether you have a more accurate version.
That's really interesting. I've never asked myself these questions. They're kind of quite vague about the sort of prescriptive ages when things happen. So there's not like an expected timeline. But I am wondering if you could make a more detailed analysis, because that's one of the things that it always bugs me when people say oh yeah, it's earlier and earlier and earlier. Well, they've got data from the last 50 years maybe, but what actually happened before? Yeah, that would be a very interesting question. There is data?
So even relatively recently in the UK and in the States, people were recording age of menarche, and it's related to nutrition. So particularly working class or slave girls being 18, 19, even 20, and that being normal then. And then that's rapidly coming down as nutrition improved, after the Great Depression there was a rapid decline. So really very recently it came down to child. It's now decreasing slightly, sort of by a month every couple of years. Still 12 years old as the average. And again, that's nutrition based, so that can even be obesity, so malnutrition sort of the other way, possibly affecting estrogen levels in younger age groups, but it's not coming down. So for instance, it's still very rare for 7-year-olds to start, but there have always been 7-year-olds that might start. So, yeah.
If it's 1500, was it 16 or 18 or?
It would have really varied on to how well you were eating. It was whether you were getting enough calories and were heavy enough, or it's not quite heavy enough, but have enough estrogen. To have gone into puberty, you have to have developed nutritionally, I suppose, is the answer.
And I think that would explain why, for elite culture, where we have the evidence, where they had good nutrition, the marriage age certainly was still very young, which would indicate that maybe they were menstruating by then. Yeah.
Hi, this was so interesting. I never thought about men as thinking of themselves as being self-contained, closed, and controlled. So when boys went through puberty and had eruptions and nocturnal emissions, things they couldn't control, was that just like hushed, or were they full of shame? What did that mean?
Yeah, that's a great point. So there was a lot of anxiety about these nocturnal emissions, again, particularly in clerical culture, precisely because it was this preaching of the body and it was uncontrollable. In the Secrets of Women tradition that I focused on here today, it's interestingly not written about much, because the concern here is female physiology. But precisely, it was a real threat to this sort of system, and people were trying to control it as much as they could. And again, it was deeply stigmatized. Interestingly, similarly, nosebleeds, because they were associated with the same sort of excess of blood in the body that would then spontaneously erupt. So they were also causing much more anxiety than today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.